Hi everyone, welcome to Water Bear Reads, where I chat about illustrated classics and modern classics. Welcome, my name is Heather. Today I am going to share my collection of illustrated The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Spring has arrived in Maine, the crocuses are out, I have a neighbor who's planted snowdrops. And also it's been raining, but when it does stop raining, it's lovely to see all the joggers and bicyclists, and I really enjoy going to the track and watching the harness racers practice. I've also been doing a lot of spring cleaning, especially the windows. And the other day I was cleaning the windows and Rikki Tikki Tavi, our resident striped chipmunk, jumped up on the ledge. It's good to see him awake and moving around. I haven't seen him all winter. So The Wind in the Willows holds a special place in my heart. First of all, it's my mom's favorite childhood book, and she gifted my son as a baby gift The Wind in the Willows by Nancy Barnhart, illustrated by Nancy Barnhart. But I also owe the beginnings of Water Bear Reads to The Wind in the Willows, because it was with The Wind in the Willows that I started to realize how many illustrated versions of classics there are on the market, and to start exploring the different illustrators of these stories. I found that when I was reading The Wind in the Willows to my son, that he really needed those illustrations, and when he did get the illustrations, he would just really zone in on them and absorb them. And it started me on this path to checking out different illustrators of different classics. Because it's my mom's favorite book, I want to dedicate this video to my lovely mom. She has always spoiled me with books. So many books that I show you guys are gifts from her, especially when I do my Jane Austen videos. A lot of those books are gifts from her. Yeah, so I am going to get started. The way I'm going to do it is I have some adapted versions that I'm going to show you first, and then I'm going to show you some versions that have original or very, very close to the original text, but they've just left out two chapters, one or two chapters. A lot of times a couple of the chapters are left out. One is The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, tends to get left out, as well as Wayfarers All, because they're not instrumental to the linear voyage of the tale. So they tend to get left out of versions that are geared specifically for children sometimes. So I've got a couple of those as well to show you. And then I'll end with just showing you the original versions, the collection of original versions that I have. So I hope you enjoy it. I am going to take a sip of tea. I have a English breakfast tea from a Beatrix Potter tea collection that my good friend gave to me. So I'm going to take a sip of tea and we'll get started. Okay, so now I'm going to start with the adapted versions of The Wind in the Willows that I have. And I've shown you guys this version of Pollyanna several times, illustrated by Kate Hindley. And so I was so excited when I discovered that Kate Hindley, who is based in Bristol in the UK, had illustrated a version of The Wind in the Willows. And this is by Nosy and they have several of these adapted classics. They have The Secret Garden and Heidi and Peter Pan and Anne of Green Gables, and I just think they are so beautiful. They're for ages 5 to 7, and it's divided into different chapters, and it's not one that you can really read in one bedtime sitting unless it's a really long bedtime sitting. It's just gorgeous. First of all, let me show you the design on the cover. Isn't that beautiful? Pretty end papers. When we were enjoying Kate Hindley's illustrations in Pollyanna, they are wonderful, but they were black and white, so it was so nice to see the beautiful color illustrations in this version of The Wind in the Willows. These Nosy Crow editions, I would not mind collecting a few of these. I think they are so pretty. I love this one when they're inside Badger's home. So cozy. The chapter heading decoration is so Christmassy. Oh, and here's Mr. Toad being taken in hand by his friends after his issue with the cars. This scene, by the way, is my son's absolute favorite scene, or one of them anyway. He loves the scene. He also loves a lot of the Toad bits. I also love this scene when they're chasing the weasels out of Toad Hall. This one's just such a pretty version. And on the back it says, "There is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats." The next adapted version I want to show you reminds me of Monet's paintings, which I'll get into later, how much Monet has to do with many of the illustrations of The Wind in the Willows. And this one is the Starry Forest Books Classic Stories edition, and it is retold by Peter Clover and illustrated by Claire Allman, who is an illustrator living in Atlanta, Georgia. And she said she had such a wonderful time illustrating The Wind in the Willows, and that Toad was her favorite because of how mischievous he is. It's illustrated in watercolor and harks back to the Edwardian period, and it's just wonderful. Although the story begins, as the original does, on the riverbank, it tends to evolve completely around Toad's adventures. I really love this edition. I always loved when Toad climbs out the window and sneaks off. And here he is on his happy way at the end when they are reclaiming Toad Hall. This one is a one-sitting read aloud. There's no chapters. You can just sit down and read it as a one-time before bedtime read aloud. My absolute favorite adapted version is this gorgeous one by Don Daly. It is just immaculate and beautiful. It's the one that if you read it to a child, it will be the one that they remember forever. It's one of those. Don Daly is from California, and he's known for doing several picture books, several classic picture books. A version of The Nutcracker, Aesop's Fables, A Brer Rabbit Story, The 12 Days of Christmas. You have these gorgeous end papers where you can see Mole and Toad and Ratty and Badger in the clouds. Just the illustrations are phenomenal. This one is just beautiful with the roots of the tree and the houses built into the tree. Oh, it's just so cool. I wanted to show you this one because I love this detail, like the little caterpillar in the leaves of the willow tree there on the edge. One of the other things that I really feel about this version is how autumnal this version is. It just gives me that sense of autumn and so many of the pictures, even the ones that are not set in autumn. Here's Toad pretending to be driving a race car. My son loved this part and he would do that in bed too. He would pretend to be driving a race car after he read this part. Here he is making his big escape and then finally taking back Toad Hall. Such a gorgeous, gorgeous illustration. This one is probably, of all of my versions, one of my most cherished and valued editions. It's just so beautiful. I love these illustrations. A young reader's edition of the classic story, illustrated by Don Daly. Now I'm going to show you a couple of versions that I have that have mostly original text, but just maybe one or two of the chapters are missing. And the first one I'm going to show you is missing one chapter, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And it is The Wind in the Willows, illustrated by David Roberts. I love David Roberts' illustrations and have done ever since my son and I read The Beginner's Guide to Bear Spotting. This is one of our favorite books. And we just really love the illustrations in this book. I wanted to show you that I have a 101 Dalmatians illustrated by David Roberts as well. It has black and white illustrations throughout. In The Wind in the Willows, he continues that sort of Art Deco style that is just wonderful. And even though it's missing The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, he makes up for it by placing pen all throughout the stories and the illustrations. And it takes a while to see them all. I actually had only spotted one when I was doing the blog post for this. And over time, I just kept seeing more and more of these pens spread throughout the work. David Roberts originally illustrated The Wind in the Willows in 2012, but this edition is from last year, from 2024. Beautiful end papers. I really love these faces in the forest. All those little faces, they look so eerie, and I think they're so cute. There's a statue of Pan there on the bureau, if you look closely. Just one of the Pans that appears throughout the book. Oh, how I love this yellow. Oh, I can't wait for yellow season, when the forsythia is in bloom and the daffodils are in bloom. It's one of my favorite seasons of spring. And this I loved because this is from the chapter Wayfarers All, which is one of those chapters that tends to also get left out, but it was kept in this version. But I love how this illustration at the bottom talks about all the places that are discussed in this chapter. Like there's Constantinople, Istanbul, and then Venice and some Greek architecture here. And I just thought that was really clever. And then this was wonderful, this page where they're chasing the weasels out of Toad Hall. Love this illustration so much. It's so pretty. And this final illustration at the end is just adorable. But yeah, this version is such a great version to read to modern children, as long as you don't mind that the Piper at the Gates of Dawn chapter will be missing. I thought it was very clever how he added Pan throughout. Very clever. The next version that I want to show you is by Eric Kincaid, and I have his work in this collection of stories that includes not only The Wind in the Willows, but Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland and The Jungle Book. And I love his style. He's a British illustrator, and unfortunately I read that he passed away in 2023. His illustrations are just gorgeous and I really love them. His illustrations are both dainty and rich at the same time. And so let me show you a couple of them. I read that he fell in love with illustration when he was reading a version of Robin Hood illustrated by H.M. Brock. I really love this one with Badger and Mole. I think it's just beautiful. And here's Toad in prison. Oh, poor Toad. Another one of Toad. And this is where Mole is dressed up as a woman and trying to get into Toad Hall. Just such a lovely version. This collection is awesome. It has Alice in Wonderland and The Jungle Book and Peter Pan in it as well. This one is condensed using the original text, but chapters 7 and 9, the two chapters I told you about, the Pipers at the Gate of Dawn and Wayfarers All, are missing from this version. Now I'm going to share my original versions with you. And these have all their chapters and the original text. But before I start showing you these, I just want to chat with you about the origins of The Wind in the Willows. It began as a series of bedtime stories / letters between Kenneth Grahame and his son, Alastair. Alastair's nickname was Mouse. And Mouse and he would write letters to each other about the adventures of Badger, Toad, Mole, and Ratty. I always find it so interesting how sometimes huge classics exist because of the most minor, mundane, everyday actions. And in this case, The Wind in the Willows owes its existence to Mouse's nanny, Naomi Stott, who fished the letters out of the wastebasket and kept them. And if she had not done that, then we may not have The Wind in the Willows. And it's just kind of interesting how everything came together. Also, when Kenneth Grahame went to go have it published, it wasn't as well received when he first published it because he had already established himself as an author with the stories from Dream Days and several other publications he had done. And I think the publishers who were waiting and expecting a story from him were expecting a story that was along the lines of the previous works that he had done. And so when they received The Wind in the Willows, they didn't know what to do with it. There had already been a slew of animal stories coming out. They felt that the market was saturated with animal stories. And it was actually on the recommendation of Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Kenneth Grahame had actually made him a copy and sent it to him, and Theodore Roosevelt loved it and recommended it to the publisher. And there's several other little bits and details in regards to the origins of The Wind in the Willows. And one of the versions that I want to show you that is incredibly valuable and such a fountain of knowledge about this story is the annotated The Wind in the Willows. I cannot tell you how much I love this version. It is just remarkable. It has the background of The Wind in the Willows, including all of the letters between Alastair Grahame, or Mouse, and his father, Kenneth Grahame. And I just found it amazing to read through these letters, and it has a very thorough biography of Kenneth Grahame, a very thorough description of how The Wind in the Willows became published, how it was simultaneously published in both the UK and in the United States. And the thing I love about it the most is that it has a section that talks about the history of early illustrators of The Wind in the Willows and gives details and a discussion about the first illustrators. And that is what I found remarkable. Also, a couple of the illustrators that are in here are very difficult to find their illustrations anywhere else. And so I also recommend this version for that reason. But let me just show it to you. There are 4 or 5 really important illustrators whose illustrations are included in this version. And 3 of these artists, I actually have the books of them, and I'll show them to you as I discuss this one. But there's some other illustrators who I do not have the books to, and who I think the best place to find their illustrations would be here, because they're expensive outside of this version. The very first illustrator of The Wind in the Willows was a personal friend of Kenneth Grahame, and it is W. Grahame Robertson. And he actually provided 3 illustrations for the very first publication in October of 1908. I've read that there were 3 illustrations, but I think what it means is that there was a cover illustration, a frontispiece, and a cover spine illustration. But nonetheless, W. Grahame Robertson was the very first illustrator to lend his artwork to The Wind in the Willows. This is how it looked when it was originally published in the UK. The American version was much simpler. It wasn't anything really decorative or anything like that. The spine here and the cover art, this is from another book that W. Grahame Robertson published. It's not from The Wind in the Willows. And this would be the frontispiece illustration here with the 3 children, and the otter and the water rat is in there as well. One thing I forgot to tell you about W. Grahame Robertson being a friend of Kenneth Grahame is that Robertson's dog was named Portly, and Kenneth Grahame named his baby otter after Portly the dog. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you that. That was really cute. About 5 years after The Wind in the Willows was published, in 1913 it was illustrated by Paul Bransom. And it had been considered a rather challenging work to illustrate, because one of the things that you find in The Wind in the Willows is that Kenneth Grahame doesn't really give any attention to size. Even though Toad is a small creature, Mole is a very small creature, they're about the same size as Rat, who is about the same size as Badger, even though in reality all these creatures are different sizes. Also, in addition to that, other objects that appear in the story, like wagons or cars or horses, appear to be the size that they would be for humans. So for that reason, and not having any previous examples, it was considered a challenge to illustrate it. The first illustrator that came along to illustrate it in 1913 was Paul Bransom. And Paul Bransom was an American illustrator who taught himself to illustrate animals with frequent visits to the Washington Zoo, and his specialty was illustrating animals in their natural state. So his illustrations don't have any clothing on the animals, with the exception of the sea rat from the chapter Wayfarers All. It's the only clothed animal in all the illustrations that he did for The Wind in the Willows. I mentioned Monet, and Paul Bransom's cover as well as the in papers mirror several of Monet's works. So there's one of them that's actually the end paper. Here's an example of his cover art here, where you can see it looks very much like Monet's paintings. One of his illustrations there. Here's another illustration by Paul Bransom that shows you the size of the creatures compared to the size of a horse, which it stays kind of realistic. Here is Paul Bransom's illustration of the only animal in the story to have clothing. So I thought that was interesting. I wonder why he chose to put clothing on the water rat. Perhaps it's because in the actual text it's described on him. So after Paul Bransom, The Wind in the Willows did not receive any more illustration for 9 years, and then came Nancy Barnhart. And Nancy Barnhart is considered by some as being the first illustrator, and that is because of a mistake that was made in the Horn book children's magazine. I think there was a misprint. So a lot of people incorrectly believe that she was the first illustrator of The Wind in the Willows, but she's not. She's the second, and if you're being technical, the third. But anyway, so she is the first person to illustrate the animals with clothing. She's an American illustrator, and not much has been really written about her. It's quite difficult to find out any information about her, but her illustrations are just gorgeous, and I'll show them to you. This, by the way, is the Barnes & Noble's edition that my mom gave my son when he was a baby. So I just love the colors that she uses. I think they're gorgeous. And there's Toad. Her artwork is beautiful. And there's also black and white full-page illustrations. Here's Toad with the washerwoman, and also black and white spot illustrations. I love this one at the bottom with Toad with his wine glass. And of course it has the boat quote on the back. It's a lovely version by Barnes & Nobles. I was at Barnes & Nobles the other day, and it has a totally different cover, the one that they have now. So Nancy Barnhart, first illustrator to dress all the animal characters. So 5 years after Nancy Barnhart came Wyndham Payne, and Wyndham Payne especially is an illustrator whose version of The Wind in the Willows is quite difficult to get a hold of. So I would just recommend enjoying them in this annotated edition. Wyndham Payne's illustrations are monochromatic, using a beautiful yellow, and this is their style. There's Mole, and Toad making his escape, and Badger. And it's quite a unique style. Let me show you the cover art, what his Wind in the Willows looked like when it first came out. But yeah, Wyndham Payne illustrated his version in 1927, so it was about 5 years after Nancy Barnhart. The version by Wyndham Payne that I just showed you would be the final version that Kenneth Grahame would see. The next illustrator to come along illustrated The Wind in the Willows in 1931, and that is Ernest Shepard. I think Ernest Shepard, at the time that he took on The Wind in the Willows, had already illustrated Winnie the Pooh and The House at Pooh Corner and was well known. And he wasn't sure that he wanted to illustrate The Wind in the Willows. He was of the opinion that this was a tale that should never be illustrated. But because other illustrators had already illustrated it, he decided to do it. He met with Kenneth Grahame twice, and one of the meetings he recorded Kenneth Grahame saying that he loves these little people, please be kind to them. This annotated version has many of the Ernest Shepard illustrations in it, but I really love this version here. It has beautiful illustrations in color as well as black and white drawings. Under the dust jacket you have a rowing toad, and you have a map on the end paper. Ernest Shepard illustrated it in 1931, but as the years progressed throughout the 30s, more and more of his illustrations were added. And this version has all of them included. Badger's house. This one's a rather famous illustration of Toad. This is Pan in the chapter The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And that whole chapter is centered around Portly going missing, the baby otter. And this is when they found him at daybreak, which is just such a wonderful moment. So beautifully written. I love that part. And another one when Toad is in jail and when they're chasing the weasels out of Toad Hall. Also, there's this lovely illustration on the back cover of the picnic on the riverbank. The final of the early illustrators that are spoken about in this book is Arthur Rackham. And Arthur Rackham was asked to illustrate The Wind in the Willows in 1939. And he completed it in 1940. Arthur Rackham had actually been asked about 30 years earlier by Kenneth Grahame himself to illustrate The Wind in the Willows, but at the time Arthur Rackham was busy with The Midsummer Night's Dream. He was an extremely popular illustrator, and he had projects lined up years down the road, and he just felt like he couldn't fit it in. And Arthur Rackham had always deeply regretted not illustrating The Wind in the Willows. And so he got his chance 30 years later. And it turned out that this was Arthur Rackham's final project. He passed away before it was even published. So The Wind in the Willows ended up being his swan song. And it's just beautiful. I have this version, and this one has the famous introduction by A.A. Milne. It doesn't have a cover. It has a kind of a spine here, but it doesn't have its cover. I'll show them to you, some of the illustrations. And there's Mole and Badger. This chapter heading illustration is also the illustration that you will see appear on this annotated version of The Wind in the Willows. And again, this version is full of Arthur Rackham's illustrations as well. So if you are looking for illustrations of any of the last 4 illustrators, you'll find many of them in here. By the way, I wanted to tell you how interesting I found this cover, because you have, in the corners, you have illustrations by Nancy Barnhart. Here you have illustrations by Ernest Shepard. Arthur Rackham's illustrations up here, And then you have Wyndham Payne's illustrations here and Paul Bransom's here. Poor Paul Bransom only got one illustration in the corner, but he got Pan, which is a very significant illustration. I just thought that was really cool. Oh, and by the way, under the dust jacket, you also have another Wyndham Payne illustration. So that is the end of my discussion of this annotated version, which has walked me through. Because Arthur Rackham was ill when he was illustrating it, a lot of the illustrations he actually did from his bed. He was way behind schedule. They had to put off publication of this book. I imagine it was a bit stressful for the publishers. But when it did get published, it sold out in a historical way. It really went fast. So anyway, so that is the final work of Arthur Rackham, one of the most sought-after British illustrators of the time. So after Arthur Rackham illustrated The Wind in the Willows in 1939-1940, there was about 20 years where there were not any significant illustrated versions of The Wind in the Willows coming out. And then in the 60s, The Wind in the Willows was illustrated by Tasha Tudor, and I love this sweet, sweet version. I read that Kenneth Grahame said that he wrote The Wind in the Willows for adults who remember what it was like to be children. And I think that of all the illustrators, Tasha Tudor would embody that characteristic. I have this dream of visiting her farm in Vermont. I would love to visit her gardens one year and take bookish photos there. Let me show you her beautiful illustrations. Here's one of them. They're just so soothing, I think is the right word. And her illustrations are kind of clumped together in batches throughout the book, so you can just turn the page and you can see several of them at once as you read. And then here's another place where there's a clump of illustrations. There you go. Beautiful. Here are the end papers, which are also just so wonderful. The next one is by Dick Cuffari, or Richard Cuffari. This one actually usually makes its appearance in the Illustrated Junior Library collection. I've been making a collection of the Illustrated Junior Library books, but I don't have this one yet. I did find this paperback, this softcover version that has his illustrations in them. Dick Cuffari was born in Brooklyn, New York, and after he served in World War II, he took on illustration. And he also has a version of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Wonder Book for Boys and Girls that I'd like to get a hold of and check out. Let me show you some of his illustrations. I think they are so bright and beautiful. These are also from the 60s. In fact, it's also 1966, the same year as Tasha Tudor. And there's Inside Toad Hall. I just love the colors he uses. They're so bright. There are also several chapter heading illustrations, spot illustrations throughout. I especially love this chapter heading illustration. He's so cute. And here's where Toad is trying to make his escape dressed up as a woman. Another illustrator that benefited from the sheer existence of The Wind in the Willows big time was Michael Hague. Michael Hague had been struggling for quite some time and to get his illustrations out there, to get his illustrations noticed. Eventually, Trina Sharp-Hyman invited him to illustrate one of the stories in a cricket magazine. Soon after that, he was asked to illustrate a version of The Wind in the Willows. And this version was a flying success. It sold over 200,000 copies in its first printing. And there's no reason to doubt why. If you see the illustrations, you can see how beautiful they are. I've had this edition for a while, and unfortunately I tore the cover at one stage, but that's all right. I'll probably put it in Mylar plastic at some point. Let me show you some of these. The end papers with a map. I love how he anthropomorphized the tree, Wyndham Payne style, or Arthur Rackham as well. One of the things I love about doing these Illustrator Explorers is the more and more I learn, the more and more I start to notice when I look at the illustrations. Doesn't that just make you so snuggly and cozy, and it's just so relaxing. I love that Christmas scene with all the mice that come caroling. Very spring-like illustration for you. There's Pan in the garden from the chapter The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, my favorite chapter. That's why I talk about it so much. Oh, I love this one, where Toad crashes again, but I just love this illustration. It's so funny. And I love the chapter headings, and every chapter has an illustration at the end of it as well. I also love that on the back it has all these ovals with the characters in them. The next one I want to show you is this edition by John Burningham. John Burningham is known for his illustrations for Ian Fleming's Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and he has such an amazing style. David Roberts, who illustrated this version that I spoke about, stated that he was very careful not to look at other illustrators' work while he was illustrating, but that he did sneak a peek and looked at John Burningham's illustrations, and he loves them. And John Burningham is his favorite illustrator of The Wind in the Willows. This is a beautiful edition. I think it was originally published in the 1980s, 1983 I think. This one was published in 2018. And it's full of black and white drawings as well as full color illustration. There's Toad with his car. John Burningham's spouse was Helen Oxenberry, and I know her from Going on a Bear Hunt. This was just a wonderful version. I love his unique drawings, and it's such a handsome addition too. Look at that spine with a boat on the edge. I really love this version. The next version I want to show you was a gift. One of my subscribers sent me a bundle of secondhand books, and one of the books that she sent me was this version of The Wind in the Willows by Justin Todd. And I was so happy to have this one so that I could photograph it for my blog because I hadn't had it before. I looked up Justin Todd and saw that he also has an Alice in Wonderland that looks pretty interesting that I'd like to check out. He's a British illustrator. I believe he studied at Wimbledon, and this version was published in 1988. But it looks very modern, actually. It looks like it came out much more recently than that. I really like this illustration with the kingfisher in it. I always love kingfishers. Owls and woodpeckers. We have a lovely illustration of Badger in his home and Ratty and Mole. This next illustration I just love, and it is with Pan's outline at dawn through the trees. I thought that was very cleverly executed. And there you can see Portley is all hidden. And then this is from the chapter Wayfarers All, and you can see the places that were visited in the clouds, which I thought was really clever too. A lovely gift sent to me by one of my subscribers, and it felt so good because I was so excited to have one of my subscribers send me books. I thought that was so neat, so thank you so much. So moving out of the 80s into the 90s, you may have heard of William Horwood's The Willows in Winter. It's a sequel to The Wind in the Willows, and it was illustrated by Patrick Benson. And after the success of The Willows in Winter, Patrick Benson was asked to illustrate The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. This is the only book with completely black and white illustrations, with the exception of the illustrated end papers, which are in color. And yet it is one of my favorites. I really love this version. I just love Patrick Benson's illustrations in this book as well as The Willows in Winter. He also illustrated the others. I think it's Toad Triumphant, The Willows and Beyond, and The Willows at Christmas, I think are the others names in the series, I believe. Let me show you some of the illustrations. I think it has so much character, and the black and white drawings are rich and full of momentum. I think they're gorgeous. And there's Badger, the gang at Toad Hall. I love this beautiful illustration of the river and Toad rowing down it. So beautiful. I love the chapter heading illustrations too, are amazing. By the way, this last illustration that I showed you with the reeds reminded me to tell you guys how much of a difficult time Kenneth Grahame and the publishers had in coming up with the name The Wind in the Willows. I think one of them had to do with reeds, which is what reminded me that I wanted to tell you guys because I saw the reeds. It was something, The Whisper in the Reeds or something, and there was a ton of different names proposed for The Wind in the Willows. Another beautiful version that came out in the 1990s is this version by James Lynch, and it's a Folio Society version. I think it came out in 1995, and I just love this cover. James Lynch is a British illustrator, and all his illustrations are done in egg tempera from his own hens. He raises the hens himself as well. And he's well known for his landscapes, And let me show you, look how beautiful that is. His illustrations harken back to Paul Bransom, the first, or if you're technical, second illustrator who kept the animals rather small instead of making them larger, and also did not clothe them. He's the only other illustrator I came across who did that. So I thought that was really fascinating. I just love these illustrations. Here's during the winter. Here's his version of Pan. It seems there's only one double page spread, but I just loved this. Isn't it gorgeous? It's so pretty. I've actually chatted to him on Instagram, and he told me that he has only one of the original illustrations left in his possession, and how much he wishes he had not sold them. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. I just love this material too, this green, which I guess would harken back to the original version that was published in the USA. And with most folio societies, it comes with a slipcase as well. For those of you who were fans of Reading Rainbow, you'll enjoy this next illustrator. The next illustrator was the author of The Tin Forest, which is a very famous Reading Rainbow book. There's this very famous episode of Reading Rainbow when the fall of the Twin Towers was discussed and the effect that it had on school children in the districts when they had to move schools. Helen Ward also was an illustrator, and she illustrated this beautiful version of The Wind in the Willows. And I have two versions of this because this was another one of the books that came with that box of books that my subscriber sent to me. I was so happy to receive this because even though I had Helen Ward's illustrations, I didn't have this version, and I really love this cover. The other cover looks like this, which is also lovely as well. And they also differ in that the illustrations in this version take up the whole page, whereas the illustrations in this version have a boundary around them. So for example, in this version you'll have just the illustration taking up the whole page, and in this version will be a border. Helen Ward is a British illustrator, and I just find her illustrations so unique and bright, and the shapes that are in each illustration just really stand out to me. There's a badger greeting his friends. Beautiful. I love her winter scenes. Here's Toad making his escape, and at the very end when they're taking back Toad Hall. But yeah, just a great version. And thank you, my friends, so much for sending me this, because I was wanting to get this version as well. I also have Helen Ward's Just So Stories, which matches, so I was so excited to get that. A version that I have loved since the moment I saw it is this one by Robert Ingpen. As you guys know, I love collecting Robert Ingpen versions of the classics. And I especially love this one because I love that bee that's on Badger's sweater. Here's a good picture of it on the back. Robert Ingpen is an Australian author, and he's done so many classics. I think I showed you guys recently his Treasure Island that we read last year. And so I just think his artwork is so beautiful. It's interesting because he dresses the animals more than any of the other versions, but he paints them in such a way to give them that feel as if they are wild creatures and not dressed at all. I thought it was very interesting. He somehow achieves that wild effect while at the same time they're dressed, they're wearing clothes. Here's Toad making his escape. Every chapter has one of these double-page beautiful spreads, and then spot illustration all throughout, all of it in color. This is my favorite one. All those yellows. So beautiful. The next one was illustrated by Mouse Guard creator David Petersen, and I love this version as well, one of my top favorites. And it is very autumnal in nature. No matter what the season, this one just screams autumn. It's a little bit pricey right now, the hardcover is, but I did notice that later in the year, in October, they're coming out with a softcover edition that you can order. I'll put the link in my description box with all the others as well. Every chapter has a beautiful chapter heading illustration with some sort of botanical, and then there's a lot of sepia and cream illustrations throughout, as well as beautiful full-page illustrations that are just gorgeous. Here's another one I just think is so cool. Badger is just such a cool character to see illustrated. I had to show you this one because it matches my arrangement behind me. Look at this lovely illustration of buttered toast and tea. Toad when he's in jail. And here's another example of that sepia tone. I also wanted to show you that the end papers have the characters. So Toad and Rat, and then Badger and Mole. I like to include a paperback version in these Illustrator Explorers that you can enjoy when you're on the go. And this one is another Alma Classics and is illustrated by Tor Freeman. And she's an illustrator. She's known for her Digby Dog series. And I love this version. I feel like this would be the version that Toad would illustrate. As you usually find with Alma Publishing, only the chapter headings are illustrated, but they're just illustrated so delightfully. One of the things that's kind of neat that I noticed when you have fewer illustrations is sometimes messages of the book kind of pop out at you in a more direct way. So for example, like Summer Tempest came his tears when Toad has come to regret all his moves and he's back with all his friends after all the trouble they've gone to stop him. And then the next chapter, they're right there with him, helping him reclaim his home. That's the thing I love the most about The Wind and the Willows, is its themes of friendship and found family and seeing past people's mistakes and being there for them when it matters most. Other than the package of secondhand books that arrived, I have received another version of The Wind and the Willows since doing my blog post. It was a gift, one of my Christmas gifts that I held aside from my book haul video that I did. And that is The Wind and the Willows, illustrated by Sebastian Menschenmoser. And Sebastian Menschenmoser is a German illustrator, and I've actually shown you his illustrations in the German version of The Never-Ending Story. Just love his illustrations so much. So when I realized that he had also illustrated a version of The Wind and the Willows, I was beyond excited. And I put this on my Christmas wish list, and I did get it. And I was so excited to get it. It has all these beautiful illustrations that are sort of more subtle, and then it has these full illustrations that just come off the page. They're so beautiful. Here's another one of the more subtle illustrations. Here's one at the very end when they're taking back Toad Hall. The final book that I want to show you is my luxury edition, illustrated by Charles van Sandwyk, and this is a Folio Society version. And Charles van Sandwyk is from South Africa and Canada. I think he was born in South Africa and then moved to Canada. If you are going to spend money and purchase a book from this Folio Society, I highly recommend this one. This one, there is an illustration on almost every single page. And I was delighted to find it. It's gorgeous, and it's illustrated throughout in the most attentive way. It's really a treasure. When I said attentive, this is an example where it has all the foods going into the picnic basket there on the edge. And you get these black and white chapter headings, which are just so gorgeous. And sometimes the black and white chapter headings are the prettiest ones of them all. Gorgeous kingfisher. And I love this picture of Toad Hall. I thought it was gorgeous. Such a beautiful version. I highly treasure and prize this edition. And I had actually purchased a version for my mom too. So she has a version. Unfortunately, she had a bit of a flood in her home. This was years ago. And I think it got a little damaged. Here's its slipcase. It has little prints of eggs and nests on it, which I just think is gorgeous. Well, that is it. I hope you have enjoyed this collection of illustrated The Wind and the Willows. Let me know which one is your favorite. I'd be so curious to know. I will be back soon with another video, so until then, I hope you continue to enjoy the spring or the autumn if you're in the southern hemisphere. And I will see you soon. Bye.